So, this is the first episode of our comprehensive podcast or how to make a podcast course. This is lesson 1, and me and Danny have been talking about making a course like this for the longest time. Especially me, I've been really interested in e-learning and making courses for people online to learn about new things. It's a objective or a goal or a kind of dream of mine that I've had for a little while now. So it just made sense to talk about how to make a podcast as the first course that we would create through Brokahomies. It's a pretty light course. It's not going to be too long. It's going to be fairly in depth, but it will have a lot of kind of prior considerations for why you should make a podcast. And so like before you make a podcast, like what should you consider? What kind of questions should you ask? The technology or like the hardware that you should have involved, the hardware or software that you should have involved in like in the creation of your podcast, and kind of like in the direction of your podcast. What can you do with a podcast, and why would you even have one? Questions like that where it's really oriented towards somebody that is just kind of flirting with the idea of making a podcast. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for a full-fledged podcaster, right? But it would be something for someone who's like really early in the podcast or hasn't been podcasting for a long time, or someone who's never had who's thought about doing a podcast but has never hasn't had the initiative or hasn't created a podcast for themselves yet. So, just getting right into it, let's talk first about the reason for your podcast, right? So, as you know, podcasts are getting super, super trendy now. They're very popular. They're coming up left and right, and you might be thinking about starting your own podcast because you see the Joe Rogan podcast, you see the H3H3 podcast, Philosophize This, I believe. Podcast that my friend showed me the other day. Lots of different podcasts coming up right now, and lots of little independent podcasts coming up left and right too, including the Brokahomies podcast featuring yours truly. But anyways, why did you want to make a podcast? Is it because you thought like having a podcast would be really cool? You have a specific thing you want to talk about? It just seemed like the right thing to do. Like really ask yourself these questions. Especially if the reasoning for your podcast is I think it's very good to have a reason for your podcast, and especially if you have if the reason is related to a specific theme that you want to talk about. For a lot of people, like I have a friend of mine who works on a podcast that she talks about real crimes that were committed in Oklahoma, and it's just a very in-depth podcast that she does, where she talks about different bandits that existed or serial killers, things like that. And I think it's really interesting that she really focused around one theme, and she felt compelled to talk about that specific topic. And that's why she chose to do her podcast. And I think that that's a very good reason because, the next thing we're going to talk about after the reason for your podcast is your podcast theme. And if you have in the case of my friend, she already has a reason for her podcast and a theme for her podcast because she's going to talk about Oklahoma, like true crimes that were committed in Oklahoma. And, that's a lot of, it's a good initiative, or like it's a good motivation for her, as well as a very centralized theme for her podcast as well. Now, if you just are interested in starting a podcast for the sake of starting a podcast, I mean, go for it. It's not like you're really losing anything out of it, and and it's not like you have to know what you're going to talk about on the podcast as you start. Now, I will discuss that you should think about what you're going to talk about before you start a podcast. But podcasts are pretty low commitment in general. So if you just want to get into just get behind the mic and start talking about something, just do it. Like the first podcast that you start doesn't have to be the last podcast that you do, right? So like, let's say that you start a podcast and you just start talking about your day-to-day life. And then, you find out that you don't get as many viewers as you want, or you find a specific topic that you want to talk about. It's like, dude, you can start a new podcast, and you still have all the software, the hardware required in order to start a new podcast, because you already bought it for the first podcast you started. So don't be too intimidated about starting the podcast, getting everything right at the beginning, because it's not gonna happen. In the case of Broke Homies, also didn't get it right the first time when we started, but we kept shifting little by little, and right now we feel a lot better about the content that we're making and what we're centering it around, right? So in our case, for like us at Broke Homies, what we do is our theme is to talk about how you can take an idea or an interest and find out how to bring that into reality. And specifically, it's how can you bring that into reality and how can you monetize that, right? I think the first part is more important, right? Like it's more important for you to, like, if you have an idea and like something that you want to do, for us to give you like a means or like kind of like a guide on how to do that. And this course that we're talking about right here is a case in point example of what we're doing. Is if you want to start a podcast, because I've had several people come up to me asking like how to start a podcast. So what do you need? And I thought, okay, well, if people are asking these questions, and obviously there's like a need for information. Like people need the information on how to make a podcast. And so and it's very coherent. Like this course is very coherent to our theme, because we want to make sure that you can bring a passion that you have, an idea that you have, into reality. We're making a podcast, a how-to podcast course that is going to teach you how to make a podcast and bring your idea into reality. So now, with that being said, you don't have to do a podcast in order to express an idea. As you guys know, YouTube is a very, very popular platform. You can make videos that are, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, instead of doing podcasts that are, 40 minutes to an hour and a half, very long. It kind of depends on what your specific theme is that you're talking about. And also, what medium you prefer as well. For some people, they don't feel very comfortable behind the microphone, but they are prolific writers. And so if you're a prolific writer that, does not feel comfortable behind a microphone, then why don't you just start a blog? It's okay to start a blog and instead of a podcast. Just because it seems trendy doesn't mean that it's always going to be the best thing for you, right? So really consider that to begin with, because you might start a podcast and like invest money in like a microphone. By the way, like a microphone costs like $20-$30, like if you just go on Amazon, so it's not too expensive, but I'd like to keep you, like, save you $20-$30 that you wouldn't have to spend otherwise, so do consider whether you want to actually make a podcast or if you want to just start a blogging website or a YouTube channel. Now, and this is, it's very important to think about this beforehand, but again, feel free to just jump into making a podcast. We're going to talk about, the actual specifics on how to make a podcast. This episode is more of a prelude as to what you should consider before you even make the podcast. So this is kind of, so if you, know that you want to make a podcast, you can just go ahead and skip to the next episode and just, if you'd like to, right? And start listening to our, or start reading or listening to our specific like lessons that walk you through the actual specifics of making the podcast. Once you already know what you want to do with the podcast, we'll be talking about like all the software, hardware that you need, how to distribute your podcast, website, social media, and monetization as well. Monetization is going to be a big one because, if you're doing a podcast and you want to keep it going for a while, then don't you want to be paid for it? Yeah. And I think that's a very reasonable thing to desire. But the next topic after the reason for your podcast is the podcast theme. So books, videos, movies, they were all created content. They're all created content that have central themes, and that's the same for podcasts. If like a book, for example, right? If a book is titled Basic Economics, for example, then what do you expect to hear about? You expect to hear about economics, right? You're expecting numbers, graphs, theorems, things of that nature, things that have to do with economics. You don't want to open a basic economics book and then have an account of European history. European history might be a little bit relevant, but you get the point. Like, you don't want it to be irrelevant. You want it to be like, you don't want to get like a basic economics book and then have it talk about cooking recipes. That's just plain dumb. You don't want that to be the case, right? And you want because the recipes wouldn't be relevant to the title of the book. In the same way, you don't want to make your podcast something like, let's say, like Waves Gaming, right? That's the name of your podcast. And then it's a gaming podcast, but then you go from talking about video games to talking about how to make craft hand soap. And it's like, then just name it. If you're going to talk about craft hand soap, then you definitely want it to the title to indicate that that you're going to talk about craft hand soap, or let's say like cosmetic items, or like soaps, and like things that are relevant to making soap or soap in general, right? So you definitely want to think about that beforehand. You definitely want to think about how the title of your podcast, the name of your podcast, or the theme of your podcast, how it's going to play into what you talk about in the podcast. Now, if you're making your podcast for a specific reason, like I was talking about earlier, then it's then it's pretty much it's pretty settled. Like, you already know what you're going to talk about in the podcast. If you decide that, like, I have a friend of mine that wants to talk about I forgot what the exact term was, but like the way that mothers feel after they give birth. And like for the following months, they feel kind of off their game, or they feel a little bit different from they usually do. And she wanted to make a podcast that was talking about that. She wanted to make a podcast that was talking about what struggles mothers would go through, after childbirth. And so, and that's a very cool theme. And that's a very, very good theme and reason for making a podcast, as I was discussing earlier. And so, and if I'm completely honest with Broke Homies, right? I'm telling you that you should find a theme early on, because at Broke Homies, we started Broke Homies as a project where we were going to talk about the U.S. from a foreign perspective. Me being from Japan, and then Danny being from Portugal. We were going to talk about how we saw the U.S. and what we thought of the U.S. in general, like our perspectives. Now, luckily, we named our podcast Broke Homies, and Broke Homies is such a malleable and kind of all-purpose name that we were able to shift from talking about U.S. politics, U.S. culture, U.S. Cooking, like foods, things of that nature, to shift from that to talking about how to make how to turn your passion into a into a reality, to turn your idea, your passion into a reality, and monetize it, right? Now, so we kind of switched in the middle of that, but that's because we had our name Brokel Homies, which was so malleable and so easy to work with, and we could change Brokel Homies to a podcast that talks about surfing, for example, because it's such a general purpose name. But that's not the same case for everybody. For some people, their name is going to be a lot more niche and a lot more defined than our podcast is going to be, or our podcast name is going to be. And so you should definitely consider your podcast theme beforehand and really think about whether you're going to do work on this if you're going to work on this theme, and you will be able to work on this theme for an extended period of time. And let's see. So we're going to talk about the podcast name in a second, because I keep bringing up the podcast name. It's one of the most important parts. But before we talk about the podcast name, let's talk about whether your podcast will be purely a podcast forever. This is a very interesting question that, whenever I was writing the coursework for this lesson, I sent this like a rough draft to a friend of mine, and he asked me a couple questions that really made me think about, oh shit, is your podcast, is it going to be is it going to be a podcast forever? Because he thought that our name Brokel Homies wasn't relevant to what we talk about, and he's right. It's not relevant to what we talk about. But that's the idea, is that if our name is not relevant to what we talk about necessarily, right, then we have the opportunity to make a podcast into whatever we want. And Danny's been talking about working with music. He's been talking about, there's a couple projects related to music that he's been talking about. And we also have this course. This is like a Brokel Homies. This is an extension of the podcast. It's like e-learning coursework, or just an online course that we're gonna put on our website. But it's not necessarily related to the podcast. We're stepping into kind of the e-learning market from the podcast market. Now, if we had named our podcast the Entrepreneurship Podcast, or even the U.S. Foreign Perspective Podcast, then we wouldn't have any room to make coursework that talks about anything outside of U.S. foreign relations. Because if we start talking about how to make a podcast, then the podcast coursework is very much alienated from what the Podcast Central theme is and the Podcast Central name is. And so you really want to think about whether you want to do just a podcast, and you are sure that you're going to do just a podcast, or you might actually go ahead and start something new that's kind of an offshoot of the podcast, or that comes to encompass the podcast later on, like a bigger parent company that has like a podcast as a part of it, or something along those lines. It requires a lot of careful consideration, especially because the name of your podcast is gonna, if you want to make something that's not relevant to the name of your podcast, that doesn't make sense for the name of your podcast, then you're gonna have to rename your podcast, and that's gonna be a lot of trouble. You're gonna have to get like all these, like your domains, like a website that you have, like you might have to get like a new domain for it. You might have to change your social media handles. You're gonna have to rebrand everything, get a new logo. It's gonna be a bitch, to say the least, right? So just do yourself a favor, and we're gonna jump with that note. We're gonna jump into the podcast name portion of this course, but do yourself a favor and name your podcast something more general purpose, right? And that might seem counterintuitive for a lot of people, and I'll tell you exactly why. That's my opinion, right? In the case of companies like Apple, Google, what does Apple have to do with computers? Right? What does Google have to do with search? What does Dell have to do with computers? So like none of these, like the three examples I just gave you, none of these company names have anything to do with the products they're making. As a matter of fact, the products that they're making are really what make the name shine. The name of the podcast, or it's the name of the company shine. And I have the same philosophy when it comes to podcasts, right? Broke Homies, we're going to be talking about, we're going to be talking about how to connect your passions to a medium and then using that, like what you do through that medium and monetizing that, right? So that's what we're going to be talking about. But, our work that we do in Broke Homies is going to give the name Broke Homies the recognition that it needs. It's not the name gives the brand credibility. It's the credibility of your company gives the brand existence. That's probably a better way to think about it. So this is just kind of a cool side note, and I think we talk about it in the podcast quite a bit. But in the case of Broke Homies, the reason why it's called Broke Homies is because Danny and I met in Oklahoma, along with like our friend group that we're a part of, right? And we consider ourselves bros and homies, as corny as that sounds maybe, that met in Oklahoma. And so we just kind of put that together and made it a little catchy name, Broke Homies. Bros and homies that met in Oklahoma, Broke Homies. It just kind of rolls off the tongue. And honestly, more than anything, I like looking at the name. Like, I'm proud of that name. This is like a funny, goofy name that really represents who Danny and I are. Not something that is so corporate and like has some like weird I'm not trying to make like a boring, monotonous company out of Broke Homies. Like, if we were to make a company in the future, for example, with Broke Homies, I'd want it to be something that's a lot more exciting and has a lot more heart in it. And I don't want it to be just some sort of random company that has a boring name. I want it to be something that's pretty that's relevant to us and has a special meaning for us, right? And I don't think that's too much to ask for. Like I don't think I'd be as comfortable looking at like the name The Entrepreneurship Podcast or like the podcast. Like to me that just sounds kind of like it's a little boring. And I'd rather enjoy my podcast and enjoy the name of my podcast and like the name of my podcast than to sacrifice my own expression or like my own thoughts for the sake of it fitting my customers and consumers, right? Like people that are listening to my podcast. So I want it to be Broke Homies because I like that it's Broke Homies. And you should do that too. That should be the most important thing for you, is to pick a name that you like. Now, if that name that you pick just happens to just work really well with the theme that you're talking about, that's an A+. That's even better. If you really like the name that you chose for your podcast and it's something that you just enjoy, if you like the name that you picked for your podcast and it works with the theme of your podcast, that's even better. That's fantastic. And so that's probably what you should aim for whenever you name a podcast, is to make it something that you like and something that if you can, make it relevant to the podcast theme. But it's not a necessity. It's something that's a lot more minor than you'd think. And the last thing that I want to talk about here, right, is who will your podcast feature? This is a little bit different from kind of like the central planning, like the rest of the central planning of the podcast. But this one's really important because if you're doing a podcast solo or with guests or with your partner, right, it's going to differ a lot. This is because the thing is you're going to have different software, different mics, like different numbers of mics, different protocols. Are you going to work by yourself? Are you going to do a monologue, a dialogue? Are you going to have multiple guests in the podcast? And that's a really important consideration. With our podcast, me and Danny decided very, very early on that it's going to be me and him. It's going to be me and him on the podcast, and then we're going to have guests. And then whenever we have guests, we typically have one of us sit out and the other person be the host for the podcast, and then have the guest speak. The reasoning for that is, since we're doing a lot of our podcasts remote, right? Because we're not having the people that we're talking to in a studio environment with us every single time. If we have more than 2 people on the call, it's generally going to get pretty cluttered, and we're going to try to talk over ourselves. And that's not a very, if you're trying to get new information or relevant information out of the guest that you're speaking to or the partner that you're speaking to, then you don't want the content, or you don't want the audio to be too cluttered, and you don't want people to try to talk over each other. So this is something that we decided very early on. And if you're doing a podcast remote, I highly, highly recommend that you have no more than 2 people on the air at once. 3 if you're really pushing it, but we did one of our podcasts with Nick and Chris from the Blood Orange Renegades, right? And whenever we had Nick and Chris on our podcast, they wanted to do a podcast together, and I was like, okay, well, that sounds cool. And so we had them on the air, and they shared one mic, and it was a pretty good time. But there was a little bit of talking over that happened, and that's just kind of inevitable because we have more people on there. Still, it wasn't like a catastrophe or anything. Like, it was just it was a podcast, and it happened, and it wasn't too bad. But it wasn't as fluid as a podcast where it's just a host and a guest, or 2 hosts, right? And so definitely think about what kind of participants that you're going to have on the podcast ahead of time, because it's really going to dictate how much money you're going to spend on microphones, what kind of protocols you should have, like in the case, and then we're going to talk about this later too, but with me and Danny, since we're doing our podcast remote because he's in Portugal and then I'm in the US, I send him an MP3 file that he mixes, and then we release our podcast, right? And since we do our podcast that way, all the guest needs is like some sort of basic microphone and GarageBand, or like some sort of other MP3 recording software. It's not that fancy. You could do it on a phone if you needed to. So as long as you can get like an MP3 file and then send that MP3 file to me, then it shouldn't, to Broke Homies, then it works for us. And, it's a pretty good system. And if you're doing your podcast remote, I highly recommend that you do it like that. Now, if you find that you want to do your podcast face to face and with people that are around you, that's a whole different consideration. Maybe you could do a 3-person, 4-person podcast, because it's a lot easier to have a conversation, coordinate whenever you're in a room together. And this is a little bonus tip, or like not a bonus tip, like a bonus question that's not on the article or on the coursework, right? But the other thing is, if you are doing a podcast in a physical space together, you can also record the podcast a lot easier. If you have one camera, then you can record everyone that's in the room. And so, and you see that a lot too. You see that like on the Joe Rogan podcast. Obviously, like in his case, he has multiple cameras, but that's a little budget difference between the Broke Homies podcast and the Joe Rogan podcast. But if you have just one space that you're having the podcast in, you can record the entire thing and just put it on YouTube. And that's an additional platform that you can make very good content for that you wouldn't be able to do as easily if you were remote. Cool. So that's all I have for this course. The next course, for this lesson, the next lesson that we're going to be doing is going to be the tech setup for your podcast. So what kind of software, what kind of hardware are you going to need in order to start your podcast, to keep going with your podcast. So keep an eye out for that, and hope to see you guys soon.